Good evening. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master's Soapbox. I am just getting started, so I'm warming everything up, and I'm glad to have you with us. As soon as my camera comes on, taking its sweet time tonight. Well, it says everything is working on this end, so we will try to figure this out. Please give me a moment while we handle the technical difficulties. Yeah, this is so good. Such professionalism on my part, yes. I'm going to, unfortunately, I have to sign outside back in because I don't know why. Well, we'll give it the old college try here. There we go. There we go. Now we're up and operational. Welcome. I am Jonathan Albin. I am the Game Master J, and this is Game Master Soapbox. Today we're going to be looking at, as usual, a group of 5 or 6 subjects, and I anticipate that it could take me up to an hour to get through these, but it might be quicker. And of course, I invite you as viewers to hop in and communicate with me, leaving messages and such like, and we will converse on subjects reference to all things games and tabletop RPGs in particular. Today we're going to be focusing, just like, well, yesterday we did a show that was specifically focused on game masters, and this time we're going to be focusing specifically on characters. And the reason to do one of each shows is that when we are talking about utilizing a game system, it is actually a multiple person decision to decide which system to use. And the role-play mechanism is not necessarily what drives the game, but it is that which defines the game. And so by setting parameters and deciding what you are going to be using as your framework, you establish the course of the game over time. So we're talking about enlightened character development. How do we look at creating a new character or building the character in a way that is coherent and makes sense and expresses what the player is wanting to achieve? We're going to look at in-game tactical superiority. How do you build the mechanisms for your character to be optimized in terms of martial skill or military engagement, physical combat. Third, we're going to talk about secret keys to rapid advancement in a game. Every one of us wants to push through and get to be at a higher developmental level within our character as we pass through time, and so learning how to make those inroads in more rapid fashion will be an assist to you as well. Also, we're going to talk about discovering hidden pathways to prosperity, and this doesn't necessarily only mean in terms of personal advancement, but also talk about the character's advancement in the story. How do we make them more profitable, have a more enjoyable life in the meta of their world, so to speak. Then we're going to talk about the navigating the landmines of lore. Game masters often have piles and piles of story that they want to tell and want to express into the game session, so they tend to bring piles and piles of that to the tabletop. And so how do we navigate through what is necessary and glean that from what is being produced in the most efficient way, so that we at once recognize the work that the game master has put into the story, but we're also able to, move right on to the next objective of the game, because quite often that's what we're really driving at. And then finally, in the last few minutes of the show, I'm going to be offering an opportunity for you to get a free copy of the Dark Shard system book. That is the rules base for the NycosRPG in the fantasy setting. It includes everything you need to create magic, to devise magical effects for your characters, to look at advancing your character through the system, and just loads and loads of really useful stuff. So we'll talk about that at the end of the episode. So I'm going to start right where I listed here as dealing with enlightened character development. Now, when we sit down to play a role-playing game, inevitably you have to create a character. You have to devise a piece of paper that represents who you are in that game reference. And that development needs to follow some form of regimentation, some way of moving from not having anything filled out onto it to being completely filled out. And character development can be done by sheer randomness. When Dungeons and Dragons originally started back in the 70s, the character creation process was you rolled dice 6 times, plugged them into a specific template, and the order in which they were rolled was important. That as you rolled them, that was the way those numbers were to spill out. So, for example, the first of the attributes that you rolled for on a Dungeons and Dragons character originally was strength, and you would roll originally 3d6. They later modified that to be 4d6 and discard 1 because the numbers were falling out unfavorably too often. There have been other systems that have been developed since then, all the way to what they call the standard array, where you don't even roll dice. You just plug in the numbers from a specific list of available numbers. And that numerical list, that standard array, is set up fundamentally to create as boring and bland and middle of the road a character as can be made. It's not intended to make a heroic character. It's not even made to make an adequate character, but it's just as a to say it in modern vernacular, it is meh. All right. So enlightened character development is actually going to the character creation process with the intent of creating a persona, a person, a personality that you will be portraying during the game. And doing so in an enlightened fashion suggests that you have part of the process. In classic, oh, that's right, and point by. Thank you very much again, Sephiroth. So nice to see you. Welcome back. Yes, the point by is a mechanism that can be used. I don't list all of them because there's a million. I'm going to, just for the fun of it, I'm going to state my rule of 18s, and this is for Dungeons and Dragons in particular. But the rule of 18s is this: if you generate your character and you have one number that's 18 or higher, God bless you. If you have 2 numbers that are 18 or higher, God knows your name. If you have 3 numbers 18 or higher, God knows where you live. If you have 4 18s or higher, then God is going to test you. If you have 5 numbers, if 5 of your characteristics are all 18s or above, then God is going to put you through the grinder. And if you have 6 18s or higher, just hand me the character sheet because you weren't wanting to play the character anyway. Fundamentally, other than that, the mechanism for putting the numbers into the characters for a standard Dungeons and Dragons game doesn't matter to me. But what I'm wanting to draw attention to is that in the current meta environment of role-play games, many times the person playing the character is building the character they want to be. Thanks, Mark. That sounds like God is getting shortchanged in omniscience. Well, if so, he'd already know the character sheet, right? But the point that I was making with the rule of 18s is that if a player's desire to have high value attributes really is foretelling the issue that they as a player don't want to have any of the challenges or difficulties, and in doing so they are putting themselves by manipulation or whatever in a situation where they don't have those problems. And ironically, that's what role-play games originally were. Now, again, this is comparing the 1970s with the modern era. 1970s, a character that was built, you were actually thinking the way an actor who's going to go get a job would be, and that is, when I look at these numbers, what do these numbers speak to me of as written, in the order they were written? So if I have a high constitution, but I don't have a high strength, what does that mean and how do I play that character? In modern iterations, however, the players can choose where they place the numbers. They can modify those numbers by their species. They can modify the environment to suit what they want. And I would posit that this is a form of wish fulfillment that actually undermines the role-play mechanism at its core. Now, having said that, an enlightened character development simply means that when you're building the character, you have an eye for what the numbers can mean on a spectrum. In other words, if you have in the NycosRPG system, we use a percentage-based system. So let's say we're talking about your physical resilience. And so your resilience might be a relatively high number like 45. Well, a person who is highly resilient is somebody who can either A, take a lot of abuse, which means they just simply aren't harmed by things as much, or B, they are physically stronger, physically, larger, etc. Or it could even be that they simply don't have the nerve endings or the pain sensors. So there's a myriad of ways that you can interpret the numbers that you have rolled for your character. So an enlightened character development is looking at the numbers as created and then interpreting the personality or the persona, if you will, of that character in framework of those numbers. An enlightened character development process therefore means that even if the numbers are not directly related to an attribute, for instance, within the Dungeons and Dragons system, dexterity is your agility, your speed, and has nothing to do with your visual appeal. Whereas in NycosRPG, the concept of grace captures not only your agility, dexterity, those kind of things, but it also takes into account your physical carriage, how you present yourself in a physical way. Are you a graceful being and such? So that's exactly right. So there we go. Yes. Right, exactly, right. So the point buy is new, and the yes. So one of the reasons why the NycosRPG was developed was specifically because the line between what is a warrior and what is a wizard is far too narrowly defined for most players' tastes. Again, back in the early days, one of the biggest, most striking things is that a wizard was not allowed, by definition, to have a sword. He simply could not carry a longsword. He was unable to do so. And yet, anybody who had read any Lord of the Rings, any portion of Lord of the Rings, or The Hobbit, was aware that... Oh, thank you for asking, Mark. NycosRPG is a saddle mechanism for embracing role play of any style, any type. So it can be used as a saddle for a 5e environment, but it's definitely not. It's not set up as a setting. Now, Nykos is a setting. The game world that I run my games in is called Nykos. That's where the name came from. But the Nykos also is the is an acronym. Afterwards, we discovered that it's the acronym, not your clumsy old system, because the mechanism of Nykos is a more fluid mechanism that you can use to overlay on the top of any role-play game, so Dungeons and Dragons, etc. So it's not necessarily an interferometer. It's not something that has to take it over, but it's a system that makes more sense. And we've had the experience of game masters switching over to the Nykos mechanism as the sole mechanism because it answers a lot of the questions that standard RPGs don't. So in the case of character development, in the formation of a persona for the NycosRPG, for example, you create 6 foundations. And those foundational values are, in effect, sort of the way we look at the attributes in Dungeons and Dragons, but they are only specifically covering the saving throw portion. And so, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, if you are making a strength save, then the die roll is modified in different ways than it would be if it was a strength check. And so with the Nycos mechanism, the strength check becomes actually a skill in that specific type of strength. So if you are bending bars, lifting gates, pushing wagons, carrying horses, whatever, those become skills. And the skills take the place of the strength check, because you don't actually use your resilience. In other words, when we say, I need to move a car, can you come help me? Somebody doesn't say, well, they might say it, but it's irrelevant. They say, well, I'm not strong. They might say, well, I'm not very good at it, or I don't have a skill. It's not my training. And therefore, it more fits the way we think. So when a player is doing an action, then he actually lists his action as the skill, and then that skill will have a numeric value. The numeric values in those cases are derivative of your original foundation scores. So, for example, if you have a resilience of, again, specifically dealing with the fighters, what would be a fighter? A resilience of 35, then your initial beginning skill in, say, sword fighting would also be a 35. But in game, as you use, yeah, exactly. That's exactly how we all talk, Mark. My strength is not enough to move your car. Yes, I've already determined that I have a 5 strength, and therefore that's not how anybody works. That's not how the mind works. So instead, we make our effort. We go contribute what we can. And I've seen people that do. You put one hand on the bumper of the car. I'll help. Yeah. So therefore, once you have a skill attribution for that ability, sword fighting or jumping off of cliffs or whatever, then that skill is then what you use to roll against. Now, here's what makes it interesting, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. You actually advance your abilities as you use them. By the way, Mark, I need to say thank you. I hadn't mentioned the fact that you're a first-time chatter, and great to have you with us. Sephiroth's been here before. Shout out to Sephiroth for being here again. We had a great conversation yesterday. My shows usually run about 40 minutes or so, and we ended up carrying on for an hour and a half. So if you get a chance to go back and watch yesterday's video on Twitch, it's really kind of interesting how the story that I went through was rapidly done, and then Sephiroth jumps in, and all of a sudden the conversation changed, and then we had just a great time. So I want to thank you again for Sephiroth. So if I go over again today, I'll probably blame you guys. No, as my father would say, I don't talk too much. You guys just listen too well. So, having said that, character and development, therefore, is once you've created this foundation and you've built these attribute values out, the foundations out, since they're never going to change again, now you can start to look at them as descriptors. Because if you have for example, you have rolled like I said, a 35 in resilience, that means you're fairly hardy. Now, we'll get into the quantum die rolling in a while, and that'll blow your mind, Mark. The idea of having one die roll generate 5 possible responses is going to change the way you think about games in general, and you'll see why NycosRPG is the next evolution, and why I say welcome to the revolution. But that now developed resilience value can be then virtually reinterpreted for you as you perceive. So, for example, let's talk about another of the foundations, grace. I mentioned before that it's your dexterity and agility, but it's also your style, your balance, your how you physically carry yourself in terms of moving and things like that. Perhaps you have an extremely low grace. Does that necessarily mean that you are slow? No, maybe you're really fast and clumsy. You see, there are ways to show the numbers in role play instead of depending on the numbers to be just numeric saves or whatever. Okay, so what will never change again are the foundational values. So in a NycosRPG character, and perhaps I'll pull up a page and show you the character sheet. Matter of fact, I did a video a few days ago. You might find it on the use of a NycosRPG player portfolio. But the first thing you develop is called the base. And base, you'll find why. I actually made this a mnemonic, makes it easier to remember how to build a character. You go through the base. Then if you're in a fantasy setting, you deal with the race. And then after you've dealt with the race, then you deal with the place. That's where they came from, what your culture is. Then the final one is your estates, or what you have. So, how would I feel about a variant of unarmed defense that uses 10 plus dex plus charisma? That would be okay if charisma was defined as such, but it's not. So it would be, you'd be stepping away from the Dungeons and Dragons model. And although I played Dungeons and Dragons from 1974 until the present, the limitations that it puts on my GMing has caused me to move in this new iteration, this new cycle of the campaigns that I'm running, to switch specifically over to the NycosRPG instead. And I'm sure there are people that use that. That makes sense. It does if you, again, look at charisma as part of style. So that's a perfectly valid way to do it. I just was specifying it's not in the rules. So, well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I learned to play from David Arneson, one of the guys who designed the game. I was 11 years old, and he was my buddy's Grandpa Dave. So we went over to the local library for a games afternoon, and we were intentionally going to play miniatures games, and we ended up instead playing this little product. He said it was something that they were developing. I don't know whether it was actually already published at that point. I was 11, so I don't remember whether it was fall of 74 or late or spring of 75. But no, Dave Arneson was the author of Blackmore. As you remember, Gary Gygax's baby was Greyhawk, and there was a second game world that was called Blackmore. And Blackmore was a little bit more dark, a little bit more visceral, and many of the NPCs, yeah, exactly, that guy. Arneson was everywhere that Gygax was throughout the entire time that TSR owned the company. And as a matter of fact, arguably, he was sort of cut out of the deal when TSR was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. But that's a conversation for another day. I do presentations on the history of the marketplace since I've been in it since then. My first article was published in Dragon magazine in '76, so that was a few months ago. So it was one of the early issues. But the enlightened character development aspect is that you get these numbers. So it's to go over them really quickly. You have brilliance, which is intelligence, wisdom, your smarts, and your ability to discern and plan and that kind of thing. Then you've got cognizance, and cognizance is your presence or awareness, alertness, attention to detail. Then grace, which we've talked about. And then beyond grace, then you have resilience, which is your ability to withstand difficulties, your physical strength, that kind of thing. Resolve, which is your willfulness and your ability to decide something. My best example of resolve is to think of the Brendan Fraser Mummy movie and the character of Benny. Benny was a person that had relatively low resolve. He would bolt whenever there was a problem. He would turn his back when there was a danger. So, oh, I see what you're saying, Sephiroth. And then the final attribute is one that doesn't fit with the standard roleplay group, and that is presence. And this is the way I describe it. It's like the stone being thrown in the pond when you walk into a room. When you appear in a place, do you cause heads to turn? Do you draw attention to yourself? Do you cut a fine figure? Those are all ways that presence, therefore, and grace kind of like are the two different sides of charisma, if you will. And so those mechanics, those pieces, yes, exactly, animal magnetism. Those values then become the foundation. Then you don't worry about them. Now, I always leave the caveat: great and powerful magics can be created that allow alterations of these numbers. So you might be cursed with a poor grace for a while by a villain, or you might find a potion that gives you an improved resilience for a while, or whatever. But the comeliness, exactly. I love that, by the way. Talking about the old days, you're bringing me back here. Comeliness as an attribute was an attempt to divorce charisma from looks, because at that time, every woman was being described as being an 18 charisma. That's just what we culturally did as gamers back then. So they wanted to separate that, because you can be a high charisma person and not be physically attractive. Instead, you might be able to convince people. You might have a strength of will. Now, see, in the NycosRPG, it actually does divorce those two somewhat, because grace is your physical dexterity and your physical grace and style, and then your presence is the other part. That's how much attention you can get, or how much you can cause people to respond. So once you have these numbers, and they're going to be static now for the rest of the character's life, you do not want to have to depend on them, because they are ultimately your last straw. They are your saving throws. So what you will do in game, therefore, is develop skills that will replace the checks against these numbers in most cases. So as I said, if you had to, if you're going to go get in a boxing match and you've never been in a boxing match and you had no skill in boxing, then you would only be getting to make saving throws against your resilience as the damage came in. And that's... Yes, exactly, Sephiroth. So, because of that, you can now take a skill, you can take multiple skills, and the skills will determine their utility at different places. Like, for example, a sword fighting skill would be great in a martial conflict, when you're actually swinging at each other. But it would not necessarily be very good for being impressive, because no one understands the tiny motions that it takes to be a good sword fighter, because you're doing it so quickly as to prevent damage and do damage to your opponent. So it's not necessarily attractive or appealing. Whereas if you took a skill in weapons prowess, now you're able to show off with the weapon and do the flourishes and the spinning around of the blade and all those really. But that's separate from your fighting skill, because that doesn't necessarily apply to the actual combat. So by having a myriad of skills that can be developed, you get the chance to stylize what it is you're trying to grow. Thank you for asking about how to create these numbers. So when we were talking about the Nykos abilities, the attributes, which are called foundations, that we've gone through, are created using a dice mechanism that I call ramp. And I call it ramp for a couple of reasons. One is it feels like you're moving up a ramp. And second of all, the acronym stands for roll the dice, assess the value, modify the target, and proceed to roll again. So ramp, just you're going to do it over again. Yes, exactly. So R-A-M-P, roll, assess, modify, proceed. So on in the case of any ramp, you're going to have two numbers you need to know. First one is the origin, or the base position. So what is it starting at? And the second one is its step. So you can ramp at a step of 5, and all of your base numbers, all your foundation numbers start at 5. So you've got a base value of 5 and a ramp of 5. So you're going to roll percentage dice against that number, trying to exceed it. So if, let's see, I don't think I have my camera set up yet for this. Let me double check. I do. Pardon me just a second. I'm going to show you the dice table, this rolling table. There we go. So we're going to roll the percentage dice against that target of 5. When we roll that target of 5, we rolled an 4. My picture's in the way. Let me get that out of the way. Here we go. So he rolled an ought 4. Well, the ought 4 does not beat the 5. Therefore, the target was not achieved, and therefore, in that case, my brilliance score would be locked in at 5. Now, a couple of notes. Because of the fact that it's a die rolling mechanism, any die rolls can be remade by the... Right, exactly. This system basically smooths out all the rough spots, and not only that, it also changes the way we look at things like hit points, and so we'll get there eventually. But so you got your die roll against it, and so let's say now we got a 5 brilliance, and we're going for cognizance. So we roll against the 5 on cognizance. 81 is more than 5. We've rolled, we assess, we modify, so now the 5 becomes a 10. So now we're going to proceed to roll again. And that's 77. 77 is more than 10. So that therefore causes us to modify the 10 to a 15. And we roll again. And you're going to keep doing this until you fail. So that's against a 15. We've made 15, so we're moving to 20. And that did not beat it. So therefore, because we were aiming at 20, okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to explain again. So creating the attributes, the foundations, I should say, because they're really not attributes. They're the foundations of the character. You're going to be using a ramp system. The value of the ramp is going to be equal to the point at which you failed to make the ramp check. Let's see the stats as I roll them. Okay, see if I can add something here. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay, so our target is 5%. No problem, no problem. Glad to help, and if there's anything else I need to do, let me know. So I have to roll against the 5. This is for, we're going to just restart because it's easier to explain. Start at brilliance. We're aiming at a target of 5. We've rolled 78. 78 is more than 5. So the 5 becomes 10. Whoops, not 0. All right, so now we're going to roll against the 10. Oop, whoa. There we go. So now we're going to roll against the 10. Okay, why is the target 5? Because if we're talking about how brilliant you are, the value is 5. Right, exactly. So now we're up to 10. So we're going to roll against the 10. And we've got a 59. 59 is more than 10. So 10 therefore becomes 15. And we roll again. Now we're going to keep doing this as long as we keep succeeding. That's 31, which is more than 15. 15 becomes 20. Roll again. Well, die table keeps rolling away. Ah! Yikes. That's 13. 13 is not more than 20. So now our brilliance is 20. Right, exactly. When you roll below, you're done with that advance. So we were going for 20, and we got a 13. Therefore, we have not made that mark. Once we got to the point where we cannot modify, that is the number. So then that number gets written down as our brilliance. So now we're going to go back and reset this to 5, because now we're going to be checking for cognizance. Oh, by the way, if you want to, you could go to NycosRPG.com, which is my website, and download for free the PDF of the form. The rule book also is available there for sale at NycosRPG.com, which is my website. So we're going for a 5 on cognizance, and we rolled a 34. 34 is more than 5, so this becomes 10. And now we're going to roll against the 10. Yes, good question. Thank you, Mark, for asking. Yes, you can. As a matter of fact, there is a really simple way to transfer a character from Dungeons & Dragons to the NycosRPG mechanism. The challenge is that once it's become a NycosRPG character, it's not possible to revert, because in other words, it's not backwards compatible, because the mechanism completely changes functionally everything. It changes the way you gain skills, it changes the life progression, it changes the way you look at damage, etc., etc. So, for example, if you were looking at just this mechanism is for creating a new character. But if you were going to transfer a D&D character, you would just simply do the following. Your brilliance is going to be equal to your intelligence plus your wisdom. You add those two numbers together, and that becomes your brilliance. Plus, if you are higher than a level 1, you can add... Actually, that's a good question. You actually can reach 95. And that's simply because there's a hard cap at 95, because the statistical significance rule of nature is that everything in the world, everything you can think of, is adjusted by statistical significance of 5%. And that's everything. That's from plant life to the way people date. It's all comes down to a 1 in 20 chance of something. And so therefore that 5% cap is the highest that you can achieve. Now, if your skill level is at 95, that means that you literally, figuratively, aren't going to ever mess up on something. And it's way more than a normal person tends to achieve, but it is possible. And I think in a while you'll begin to understand why, because you can actually achieve those kind of numbers way earlier rather than having to spend all the energy to go to that level of skill. But you could. Pardon me. So, alrighty. So we have to roll against. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get back to my regular screen here. There we go. So now you understand a little bit about how the die rolling mechanism works. We actually go a lot more into that in the video on how to play. Oh, also, I want to mention, I'm going to mention it later, but if you attend my how to play presentation on Saturday, it's a free event. If you go to startplaying.games and find my NycosRPG starter event for the 10th of June, if you attend that, then you get at no cost a downloadable PDF of the Nykos rules. It's a book that in print will be $25, and online for the PDF is normally $10, but you'll be able to get it for free just by attending that event. So where am I quoting the 5%? This was it was taught in statistics classes when I was in school. That was maybe a couple of months ago. But it is what math. For example, when people talk about doing a poll of persons, they almost always talk about the degree of error or percentage error, and that percentage error is somewhere between 0 and 5. 5 being on the margin. Yes, this generation method does create a bell curve. It does not top out. In other words, you could feasibly go all the way to 95%, but the law of diminishing returns, if you will, says that you won't. And normally a character's foundational numbers will be someplace between 25 and 45%. So yeah, it will follow a bell curve. So generally speaking, you're going to get numbers between 25 and 45 across the board. The reason for that is that, generally speaking, if we go to pick up any skill, generally a third of the time we'll do okay, a third of the time we're going to botch it, and a third of the time we're going to make mistakes and still accomplish the task. And as you gain more skill, the chances of you foiling or causing a problem go down as your skills improve. And so by setting a foundation that is a bell curve, you make it so that you end up with a normative value of around 35%. It's important to know that, because when you're a storyteller and a game master, then you want to generally set your monsters at a value that's going to be equal to that 35% for dealing with anybody on anything, and therefore you can shove the numbers up or down to make the difficulty go up or down, so it makes it easier. So how would a fire emblem translate on Nykos? I'm not sure what you mean by fire emblem. That's a term that I'm not familiar with. But if you are talking about yes, the Calcium's skill-based system is similar. Their mechanism for tracking life force is a considerable way off from what I'm going to be proposing. But yes. So, okay. So, as far as any RPG out there can be played using the NycosRPG, either as a saddle, which you use it to amplify what you're already experiencing, such as taking care of the saving throws and calling them checks against your foundation or whatever. But so any mechanism you use is fine. As far as what you want to determine to be movement, you can use the D&D move rate. You can use Fire Emblem or whatever, and move your figures or models across the board. The real point here is that the role play mechanism of NycosRPG is dealing with the role play aspect as compared to the die rolling mechanism. So you can use whatever mechanism you prefer. And I just think eventually you'll see that there's benefits of using the ones that I'm going to propose. But anyway, so strength, brilliance equates to wisdom plus brilliance. Resilience equals strength plus constitution. The grace is equal to dexterity plus charisma, which you've already mentioned. Cognizance is equal to dexterity and wisdom. No, dexterity and intelligence. Dexterity and intelligence. That's what you're drawing from your surroundings, intellect-wise. Then resolve is wisdom and constitution. Presence is charisma and strength. So with those numbers, you basically have each of the attributes from Dungeons and Dragons equating into two of the others. So it crisscrosses, creating kind of a safety net, and that's why it's perceived to be like the role-playing saving throw base. So once you have that group of 6 set up, then every action that you take will either result in a saving throw against that number because you don't have a skill in it, and it's just a default, I didn't hurt myself, or it's going to be a check against a skill. How do you develop skills? Well, skills are a result of life experience. And in creating a character, which we're not talking about in this case, we're talking about transferring, but in creating a character, you would take the final point of creating the character is that you create a 7th stat, which is called the foundation itself. And the foundation is the average of all the other numbers. And literally, it's the stopgap. If you have failed a result, for example, a resilience check, and you're about to fall off a cliff, you are still granted one more check against your foundation. And the foundation is the average of all of your numbers. So you would add strength, you'd add brilliance, cognizance, grace, presence, resolve, resilience all together, and then divide by 6 to come out with what the foundation's value is. That foundation's value would therefore be your final saving throw. No, well, actually, they don't, because you didn't. I didn't get to the last part, and that is once you are transitioning the character, you add to each of the appropriate numbers the level of the character you're bringing over. So if it's a D&D character at 5th level, you'd add +5 to each of the foundation scores for the appropriate class. So if you're dealing with a rogue, then your dexterity would go up and your constitution would go up. Or if you're a fighter, your strength, and then those attributes that have those add together. So right, exactly. So that would notice that the +24 puts you right at the bottom edge. What I said was the average between 25 and 35. So it is a way to get into the window, and then the level of the character coming over gets added in. That's because once you're into the Nycos RPG, your character never has to take another level of advancement at all, because instead they gain. Yes, you are limiting yourself compared to the creation of a character. Yes. Exactly. And that's by design, because most players have a specific character they would want to bring into this system if you were going to play it for the first time, because the character would at least feel familiar, and therefore it's a way to transition them over. But even if those numbers seem low, realize that they are going to accelerate much faster than they would in a standard D&D configuration. Let me explain how that works. Every time in game you utilize a skill that your character already has, then that skill improves by 1, whether you succeed or not. And let me restate that. So if you are making a check against your running skill, then if your skill or your skill is going to be based on your grace. So if your grace is 30, then your skill starts off at 30. And the first time you run for a distance and want to see whether or not you can achieve your goal, then you roll percentage dice against that. If you roll a success, or if you roll a failure, in either case, your running skill now goes to 31. Now, it can only advance 1 point per game session. Even if you run multiple times within the session, you can only advance it 1 time. But check this out. Grace as an attribute, if you look at it compared to the Dungeons and Dragons attribute, your dex modifier would apply in multiple cases, and so is true in the case of grace. So you might have a skill in tightrope walking. So you run for a distance, you succeed on that roll, the next thing you're going to do is attempt to tightrope walk. So that tightrope walking is a separate skill. Again, if it's a brand new character and it hasn't done any advancement, it's going to be at 30 as well. Yes, it's going to feel like that because your numbers are all going to be much higher, but the success failure rate is going to be based on that compared to a standard number. Yes. Now here's why this is different. The concept of rolling against a skill in every game you've ever played has always been a make it or break it. You have a die roll targeted, you roll your dice to achieve that number. If you have modifiers, you add it to the die roll to attempt to overcome that target level, but if you don't, you have failed, and that's it. Succeed, fail. Now, ready to have your blow mind? Hey, the Imaginite, welcome, glad to have you with us. We are talking about the NycosRPG and the mechanism of it and how it all works together. And you got here right at the perfect time. I'm going to blow everybody's mind. If you think of any game that you can play with a dice involved, with the possible exception of Yahtzee, when you roll the dice are generally rolled to achieve some target number. So in role-playing games, you have an attack roll, and the attack roll is going against a target armor class. And if the target attack roll is higher than the armor class roll, then the attack hits. You following? So once you have that idea, now I'm going to blow your mind. The reality is that in the NycosRPG mechanism, one die roll, every die roll, generates not 1, but 5 possible results. I call it quantum die rolling because it's literally like quantum physics. When you look at where an atom is, it may not be there. It might be up to 5 places away, depending on what you're talking about. So in this case, again, thinking only of the concept of the target. Let's say we have a target of 35%. So we roll percentage dice, and in the Nikos mechanism, since it's all statistics-based, if you have a 35% chance, you are rolling to achieve a number 35 or lower. So it still sounds like a regular die roll. Roll your percentage dice. Is it under that number or not? But that's only the first value you get from your die roll. The second potential value you have from the die roll is a double up value. And that is the value plus itself. So if the target is 35, the double up value would be 70. Therefore, that gap, 35 to 70, is a partial success. And where you are on that scale determines how much of a success it is. From a role play standpoint, this is important. From a mechanistic way, it confuses things. But in a role play mechanism, it therefore lets you see where you were compared to your band of normal. But it also creates a third value, and the third value is the double down. Now, I use the term double down. It really means half down, but it sounds better to say double down. It just rolls off the tongue better. So therefore, in the case of a 35 or 30, your double down, I'm sorry, 35, double down would be 17, rounding down. So therefore, 35, half of that would be a 17. So if you roll the percentage dice and you rolled below the 35, but over the 17, that's considered a nominal success or a straight success. That's just, we did what we wanted to do. If, however, you got really extremely lucky and you've rolled under that 17%, then that 17, 16, 15, 14, all the way down, that becomes a wild success. And wild success means that the game master will grant you not only what you were attempting to do in that turn, but more. So perhaps more damage, perhaps a positioning change, perhaps a kind of an option. And then finally, the last is a perfect roll. And just as I said that there's a 5% chance of statistical significance, a 1% chance is a statistical miracle. I know it doesn't seem like it when you're rolling dice, because it seems to happen when you're trying to roll something else, you roll a 1 all the time. But mathematically, a 1 in 100 chance is that it's a 1 in 100 chance. That's kind of cool. And so that becomes a perfect success. And that perfect success grants basically a doubling of the effect of a success. So if you would hit for an amount of damage, then perhaps the perfect success gives you double that. So therefore, when you're talking about your die rolling, you're looking at giving your number and your target to the game master each time, because he can then do this quick calculation. And you may have already figured it out and be ahead of him on it and know that this is a double down success. But by providing him both numbers, he's able to do the math himself. So yes, it's exactly the hybrid, if you will, between those two mechanisms. You're giving yourself more than one possible target, but you're graduating the outcome nominally by range, so to speak. And therefore, with the double up, double down, and the fact that most of us can do doubling of numbers in our heads and halving of numbers in our head, there's not a need for a combat chart and grid and all of the kind of things. So literally, it's I'm rolling for a target. I roll my percentage dice. I roll a 32 against a 35. That is a straight success. If I roll that dice and I end up with a 15, 15 is less than 17, so that's a double down success, wild success. If I roll and I get above the 30, but I don't quite get to 60, then that's definitely going to be a partial success. Yes, you will need to ask more questions. So there are 4 ways, and this may solve some of your questions before you ask them. There are 4 ways that die rolls are necessary in an RPG. The first one is for skills checks, and Dungeons and Dragons and all games do fundamentally the same way. Roll a dice and a target. NycosRPG does roll a dice and a target with a range, so you can actually partially succeed at opening a lock. I know it seems crazy, but I've had locking mechanisms where I could feel that I got one of the tumblers, but I couldn't get both of them. There are possibilities that things can go partial, and just like it might go wild. Like, well, not only did you defeat the lock, but you broke it. You know, you took it apart. So there's all kinds of different ways you can do. So that's just checks, and a check is always rolling against your base value. We haven't talked about core yet, and I'll get to that in a minute. But if we were talking about, for example, you're making a check on lock picking, and you've taken a lock picking skill, it's going to be derivative from grace, and therefore you're going to be rolling against your grace attribute, but only as the nominative skill. So the lock picking skill at 35, you roll the dice, succeed or fail, it now goes to 36. But the success or failure determines whether the lock got opened. That's simple. And certain, for example, there are certain cases where the wild successes and the partial successes don't matter. In the case of a lock, it's either unlocked or it's not unlocked. And therefore, if you got a partial success, it is a success. And therefore, the graduation of the difficulty of the kind of lock is up to the game master to say, this is going to require a double down success. This is going to require a straight success. This is a regular lock. You've got your complete range of chances. So that's checks.